When Sarah heard that Abraham had almost sacrificed their son Isaac, she dropped dead. The horror of his act, the potential violence, the terror that Isaac must have felt, the willingness of Abraham to imperil their son, we can imagine that all of this conspired to stop her heart. Even the relief of knowing that Isaac had survived the ordeal could not save Sarah. And so, at the beginning of this week's Torah portion, after the horror of Abraham's actions, Sarah drops dead. Now, Abraham acted out of idealism. Many people point to his willingness to give his own son to God as the epitome of faith, as the ultimate example of sacrifice in the name of a higher principle. I've never much bought into that notion. At the beginning of the ordeal, we read, Veha Elohim nisa et Avraham, and God tested Abraham. I think Abraham failed the test. I choose to believe that God wanted Abraham to distinguish himself from the surrounding culture by refusing to sacrifice his son, by holding life as the highest ideal. Now, admittedly, my views disagree with traditional interpretation. But as Reformed Jews, we embrace our obligation to study Torah and understand it ourselves, both with the aid of traditional commentary and without it. Abraham failed the test because he put principle above human life, above the life of his own son. And when we adhere to an ideology or principle that leads to unnecessary death, we need to revise or reject that ideology or principle. We still have the same problem today. 4,000 years after Abraham, we regularly witness the horror of child and human sacrifice for the sake of principle and ideology. These sacrifices occurred this week in a small church in Texas, at a country music festival in Las Vegas, a nightclub in Orlando, and children sacrificed for principle at Sandy Hook and Columbine. Every time, with AR-15s and bump stocks and handguns, children and young people gave their lives. The executioners showed no remorse. With stockpiled weapons and endless ammo, they took lives and ended families and brought untold pain and horror, pure horror for those who perished and those they leave behind, all for the sake of ideology. We allow death and destruction and horror in order to maintain the twisted ideology of essentially limitless gun rights. Time and again, we put the rights of people to have guns above the lives of tens of thousands of Americans each year. Not Abraham's near sacrifice of one boy on a mountaintop. No, we Americans sacrifice 30,000 people each year to the right to bear arms. And enough is enough. Now, we pull out the rituals around those kinds of sacrifices. The priest of the religion of guns genuflect to the media and public by declaring that mental illness and poor enforcement cause deaths. But these 30,000 people do not die because of mental illness. They do not die because an unenforced law pierces their skull or tears apart their hearts. They die because of the ideology that insists on an incredible availability of guns, because of the ocean of steel and lead that fills our nation from one shore to the other. Mental health and poor enforcement have an impact, but the data are clear. Over the last 50 years, the more guns in a given country, the more mass shootings in that country. America had 4 times more mass shootings than the next deadliest country, the Philippines. With 4.4% of the global population, we have 42% of the world's guns. From 1966 to 2012, 31% of the gunmen and mass shootings worldwide were American. Without all the guns, this could not be the case, no matter the state of our mental health system or the enforcement of existing laws. Why do we make the sacrifice to the gods of steel and lead? We pay this tribute because the ideology of guns has been tied up with identity and politics, tethered to a sense of individualism that insists that no one can protect us but ourselves. This attitude, fed by a mythic Old West sensibility and an isolating individualism, requires that we pay an annual blood debt. We pay because people believe that if we limit the rights to own guns, that the government will take away hunting rifles. We give up our children because the NRA preaches that reducing the ammunition capacity of a clip would lead to the confiscation of revolvers. We watch friends and neighbors bleed to death because militiamen preach that licensing requirements for guns are akin to fascism. There's only one word for this sort of thinking: paranoia. This is the part of the sermon where I say that people do have a right to bear arms, and that we can make simple, reasonable, legal moves to make everyone safer. This is the place where I talk about smart triggers and ammunition limits and banning bump stocks and increasing mental health funding. You too can read the articles about so-called sensible gun control measures. And I do support those things, and I do not believe that at this point they can have enough of an impact. And I do not have any better answers. I only cry out for the sacrifices that we make to the gun gods. I seek any way to drain the ocean of lead and steel that drown 30,000 people each year. I think that Abraham failed the test when he brought Isaac to the mountain to sacrifice him, but I don't think he was crazy. He simply went with a prevailing religious culture, a culture which accepted and even encouraged child sacrifice. In the same way, I see people of goodwill in Congress and the executive branch and on the bench who succumb to the principles and ideology of so-called self-defense, of so-called gun rights. Like Abraham drawing the knife to slay his son, these officials give in to the politics and gun culture of our day. The difference is that Abraham did not kill Isaac. God stopped him from going through with it. Who is going to stop us? Who's going to prevent us from continuing to accept the sacrifice of children today? Where is God's angel calling from heaven to say to us, do not raise your hand against your children or do anything to them? We cannot be like Sarah. We cannot drop dead from the horror of human sacrifice for the sake of ideology. We need to stand up and call the sacrifice what it is: death for the sake of essentially limitless gun ownership. We can then push for and work for those sane gun laws. And more than that, we can take a page from Abraham and from the NRA, and we can build an ideology of our own, an ideology of life, an ideology of trust in law enforcement, an ideology that supports the many over the few, and that disentangles patriotism from the cult of firearms. When we build that movement, when we hold high those principles, when we vote according to those ideals, perhaps we will be the generation blessed to finally see the end of child sacrifice. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May this be God's will.